This is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Cool. Hi, everybody. We'll give a few moments for people to come on in, and then we'll get rolling. Let me make sure I'm recording this thing properly. There we go. Cool. So first thing I got to say is thanks, everybody, for taking time out of your busy weeks to check out our HADR virtual chapter. And a big thanks to Matt for speaking today, too. Okay. We'll go and get started here. So a little bit of paperwork to go through first. Past community news. So first and foremost, we have no conference bridge. Audio is just through GoToWebinar, but it is being recorded, so you can check this out at any point in time afterwards. If you're interested and want to make a social media buzz, HADRVC hashtag out on Twitter. I highly encourage you all to ask questions in the Q&A section of the GoToWebinar application. We're going to have a handful of breaks during the presentation and some time afterwards for questions. So I want all the questions that you've got because I want to see this thing go. Just as a reminder, we do meet monthly on the second Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern every month. We are looking for you. We are interested in not only speakers, but we're interested in topics. So if you're not comfortable speaking but have a topic that you want to see, let us know. High availability at SQLpass.org. If you're interested in speaking, we definitely want to talk because not only do we love good topics, but we want to see good new presenters and help people get more experience with this sort of thing. So let us know. For upcoming meetings, in August 14th, we've got one on monitoring availability groups from Tracy Bogiano. September is still to be determined. October 9th, we have always on availability groups. Let's see, Windows and Linux deployments, which is really cool, from David Pless over at Microsoft. And if you have the chance at all, get out to the PASS Summit. It is one of my favorite conferences. It's some of the best technical content that you're going to get. It's some of the best networking that you're going to find. You got to make the time to go. And if you need any encouragement for your manager or boss, let us know. We're happy to go out of our way to help you get there because it is definitely worth it. If you're interested, we are looking for sponsors for PASS. We are looking for volunteers for different events, all kinds of things. PASS needs help with a lot of these different events because there's a lot of stuff going on. If you're interested, PASS actually has a career center up and running. So there's jobs, you can post an anonymous resume. For our company personally, we're out here looking, because we may be hiring pretty soon. So we're interested. Keep up. If there are things out here that you're interested in, check it out. There are a lot of virtual group meetings, not just the HADR virtual chapter. So DBA Fundamentals coming up actually in just a little bit. I got Italian, which is really cool. Data Architecture, App Development, and Global Hebrew actually coming up all within the next week. In the next little over a week, DBA Fundamentals, Women in Technology, Saturday Night SQL, Business Intelligence, and Database Administration. A lot of really good topics out there. Tons of free information, and just about all of these are recorded. So if you don't have the time to make it during these time slots, go look at their virtual chapter websites. The recordings will be out there. And then more Saturday Night SQL and Women in Technology through the middle of August. The list of the groups is incredible. There's something like 20 virtual chapters out now and just tons of really good information. So not just us, check them all out. Great info. SQL Saturdays, if you've never been to one, these are some of the best events that you're going to find. They're on a Saturday. They're free. They're phenomenal. A bunch coming up. There's Louisville, Sacramento, Albany, Columbus, Baton Rouge, and Indy. If you are outside of the U.S., there's tons all over the place. Paris and Manchester, UK coming up, Melbourne, Sydney, Sri Lanka, just phenomenal events all over the place. And I encourage you, go to these things. These are the people that have been doing the blog posts and the authoring and the training that we've all been studying under for years, and they're there for free and they're accessible. So make the time and go. Join PASS. Chances are you're already a member. If not, join up. It's phenomenal. Great networking, great people, helps your career. And you can check out Pass out on SQL Pass at the Twitter or on Facebook or on LinkedIn or Instagram, actually. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Matt Gordon here.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and
There
get
you go.
let me get the slideshow rolling and get everything on the right monitor. That always helps. And let me know if you can see my screen.
That looks great.
Excellent. Okay. So yeah, before we dive into my talk, I do want to echo what David said about Pass, and especially with this talk. The bones of this talk is the very first talk that I gave, probably 3 years ago now. And getting involved with Pass from a volunteer standpoint, speaking standpoint, running a local group has absolutely changed my life. My career arc is far different than it would have been before I started doing this stuff. So everything he said is true. There's tons of virtual groups looking for help. Your local group is probably looking for help. If a local group doesn't exist for you, create one. That was what I did about a year ago last year, and Lexington Pass is having its 6th meeting tonight. And so that's been a great resource, not only for me, but for the folks we have coming. We have people that have changed jobs just as a result of that group, people they met, things like that. So Pass does awesome stuff, and it's really, really cool to be a part of. But anyhow, you probably didn't come to hear me talk about Pass. Hopefully you came to hear me talk about always on availability groups. So I do want to add kind of a caveat to the title there. Always on is not a feature per se. There are different components of it. This talk is specific to always on availability groups as opposed to always on failover cluster instances. But if I had explained all that in the title, the alliteration gets a little rougher and the title takes like 2 slides. So just to let you know, if you came here wanting to know and learn about FCIs, that's cool. Feel free to throw a question in there and I'll get to it if I can. But this is particular to always on availability groups, which I'll abbreviate as AGs for the rest of the time here. So here's a little bit about me. I'm a data platform solution architect for a company called DMI. I'm part of our data platform and analytics group, which is really, really strong group. We also have other divisions that do app dev, mobile dev, things like that. So we're able to help solve a lot of problems for you, not only with your data, but with development as well. You probably didn't come to hear me talk a lot about that, but I did kind of want to throw that out there because they're nice enough to let me spend the hour to do this. If you want to contact me personally on Twitter, I am SQL@Speed. That is my blog URL as well. And feel free to provide feedback either place and also via my email address as well. The usual rule is if you thought the talk was fantastic, tweet about it, use the hater VC hashtag. If you thought my talk was terrible, I want to know that too. I prefer that to go on email over social media, but either way is good. Every time I give one of these talks, I learn something. And if there's feedback that you think this can be better, please let me know. Just don't send me a tweet that says that I suck. I'll take that to heart and say, okay, that probably wasn't very good. But if you provide a little context, that helps me out quite a bit. So here's a little bit more about me. So I've been doing this about 15 plus years, actually about 17 now. I've managed DBA teams, dev teams. I've embedded with dev teams, managed data centers as well. So I've kind of come at a lot of the issues that I'm talking about here from all different angles. And one thing you'll notice, kind of underscoring this talk, is it came from experiences that I had where either these were mistakes that I made or mistakes that friends of mine made. They were nice enough to let me share with a group. But to be candid, most of them were mine before I really knew a lot about this stuff. So definitely want to hear your feedback. If you're facing something along these lines, similar, whatever, hopefully we can chat about that over this hour. You may have noticed that my Twitter handle and domain name match, and you may have wondered why that is. Even if you didn't, here's why. So this is stuff I do for fun. I love talking about data and availability and all that stuff, but I will talk your ear off about race cars. So anyway, that's what I do for fun. So now I want to know some about you guys. And I know we weren't able to put a poll up, so if you feel free to respond in the chat portion. So I am curious, kind of for a breakdown of who here is responsible for administering an always-on AG now and is here to learn, maybe some things that they need to be doing right now. I'm also curious who's here because they've been told or think it's going to happen where they're going to be responsible for running an AG in the future, and this is something that's pretty new. And as a third point, I am curious if AGs are part of your administrative responsibility or going to be, are they in production? And more specifically, are they in production only? That's not a soapbox I'll spend a lot of time on, but I will say if you're dealing with an AG that's only in prod, I would lean on managers as hard as you can to get a test AG somewhere. It's going to make your life a lot easier because they're going to come to you with questions all the time. Well, if we run this upgrade, how long is it going to take? If we do this failover to do this bit of maintenance, how long is it going to take? And if you're being truthful, when you have it only in prod, it's an educated guess at best, and sometimes you won't know. So if you can get an AG that in some way corresponds to what you're running in prod, that's going to help you serve your company better and help keep your stress level down, which is what this talk is all about. And a final point here, it won't hurt my feelings at all if you have the Belgium-France World Cup pre-match. I promise I'll be done by 2 when it kicks off. So you can move from pretending to work by listening to me to pretending to work by watching soccer. Anyhow, so here are the top 5 tips, and really this probably turns out to be about 7, but here's kind of the top 5 areas we're going to talk about. We're going to go over quorum design. That's the underpinning of all this stuff. It's really critical to understand that, and you'll understand just how critical that is with the first story that I tell you. We're then going to talk about read-only routing lists and how those can help us. I continue to be surprised that it's not a feature that I see utilized as much as I would expect, and there are some real benefits there. So I want everybody to kind of understand that and see if it fits where you're at. We're also going to talk about synchronizing users and logins, and I'm going to show you a very simple way to do that everybody can do regardless of version or comfort level with scripting and things like that. And then I'm going to talk about maybe some better ways to do that than what I've shown you. We're going to talk about backup strategies as well. Depending on what your backup strategy is now, when you create an AG and you've got databases in there, your strategy may change a bit. And we're going to wrap it up with maintenance strategies, understanding some tweaks that we need to make there so we don't get phone calls in the middle of the night. And on that note, if we take nothing else away from this, this is the face we're trying to avoid. Before I got into consulting, this is the face I made about every other day at 3 a.m. when something went sideways and inevitably the call worked its way up to me. So hopefully everybody walks out of this call with some tip that helps them keep this look off their face. And as a side note, this is my wife's favorite slide of the whole thing because it's got a dog on it. Anyhow, so let's get into the technical content here. So we're going to start just understand kind of the basic terminology. And if you want more details than this, happy to chat about this. I'll probably take a break for questions here in a handful of slides. But at its root, what is cluster quorum? So it's how the cluster monitors its health. And that's a really simplistic version of what it is. But at the core, that's what it is. And what it really is understanding of the nodes that get a vote, are there enough of them there for you to do business? Like if you're ever part of Student Senate or any body that followed Robert's Rules of Order and all that, there's a quorum you have to have that's generally whatever the designated percentage is, often a majority of that body, so what they do can happen. It can be official, and that's no different here. And so it's really important to understand this because you may have all this other cool stuff going on, and every slide after this part, you've done everything I said, and you're like, we're set up, this is great. And if you don't understand the quorum and there's an issue and you lose it, then it can make your life tough. So, like we said, why is it important? If the quorum is absent, the cluster will be set offline. The availability group listener is a cluster resource. And speaking from experience on this, it can be a bit confusing, even if you're a senior person, but especially for junior folks on your team, if you're on a team. It can be pretty confusing because a lot of times the ticket, the call, whatever they get, the phrasing is going to be the database is down. And I've fallen victim to this too, where I spring out of bed at 3 a.m. and they say database XYZ is down. Like, geez. And you fire up your laptop, you go to look, and your brain goes right to the server, maybe the primary node, and you go look and you can see stuff, it's active, you can sign in, and you fire back to the ticket at 3:03 and say, nothing's down. Well, what they meant is the availability group is down. If they're accessing it via the listener, which I would recommend, if they've lost the cluster, the instances generally will stay active. So if somebody hooks directly to those, or in your kind of middle of the night fogginess, you go there too, you're going to skip the fact that the listener's down, the AG's down. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind here. And it shouldn't be incumbent on your users to understand the terminology, but this is something you'd want sorted, like I said, especially with the team, or if you contract with a place to do support overnight, kind of basic stuff. A lot of times what they're going to report to you is not actually what's happened. So if the database they say is down is in an AG, definitely I would recommend logging in via the listener first, because that's going to direct your troubleshooting better than maybe the way you would otherwise do it. Another key thing here is, and I get this question probably every time I give this talk, is who should decide on the design? If you have 2 different data centers, or 3, or however many, what's the rule? And the story I have on this is the very first one of these that the company that I used to work for, the very first one of these we ever set up, we had very siloed things between operations and the DBA team, which was essentially me and 2 other people. And we were all kind of fairly new to this. We were a very early adopter of all this stuff. And even though 2 of the 3 DBAs, we had backgrounds as Windows admins and things like that, as the operations folks were very protective, some might say too much, of their setup and kind of understanding what went on. So they selected the quorum design, did not share it with us, but everything was up. We were able to install everything, set up an AG, we got our production environment going, everything was running great. We were thrilled with it. The first time we went to do a failover test, what the DBAs unfortunately discovered was that 3 of the 4 voting nodes were in the primary data center. So when we took the primary data center offline, because there was some wiring being done, so they had to take power away from the building for about 4 hours, we discovered that our cluster went away as well. And this was a surprise to us, and it was not fun because unfortunately by this point, this was a live environment, and we were discovering this along with the customers on the call as well. So that was an uncomfortable situation, as you might guess. And so the takeaway from that is this: the decision should be as collaborative as possible. And I understand, especially as a consultant now, I go to companies that are very, very large, and you don't get the kind of interplay between the groups that you need. Whatever can be done to bridge the gaps between DBAs and operations, it's worth the effort to do that. Maybe the decision isn't in the DBA's court at all, but they should understand what the setup is, understand what the possible pitfalls might be, and understand what their responses should be based on where the failure is. If you go in completely blind, as I did years and years ago, generally that's going to be exposed in a very uncomfortable way. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, if you're running an AG or you think you're going to, this is the bullet point I want you to take away. Absent all the technical stuff, this will make your life much easier if you and your Windows folks, or even Linux now, as long as everybody's on board with what the design is and what can happen and how to fix it when that happens, everybody's going to be a lot better off. I'm going to briefly go over the modes here and then probably take a quick break for questions and water. So here's kind of the 4 basic modes. This is not meant to be a detailed document describing all these. This is culled from TechNet articles. Obviously, if you want to take a deep dive into clustering stuff, there's a lot of good resources out there. Lots and lots of blogs, all that stuff. This is not meant to be that just kind of a quick slide so you can go look at this and say, this is maybe the way it's recommended. So I'll skip kind of straight to the second bullet here is node and file share majority is what I see a lot of. The very first time I gave this talk, this was, I won't say more difficult, but your options here were not quite as slick. Now with Windows Server 2016, if anybody's fortunate enough to be having that, you do have the ability to set up some cloud witnesses, which are a cloud witness, which was always kind of a difficult problem to solve, because back when this started up, the cloud adoption certainly wasn't nearly as advanced as it is now. It's very difficult to get my company then to embrace anything in the cloud at all. Sometimes that's still the case now, but if that is an option for you, that can be kind of a cool thing. Your other option here for a file share witness is just to set up a server somewhere, preferably a third location that kind of bridges the gap between the two if you have 2 data centers. If you don't, that calculation's a good bit easier. So the official Microsoft recommendations here, and of course their edge cases to all these, is you can use node and file share if you have an even number of voting nodes and you're running a multi-site cluster. It's also recommended if you have an even number of voting nodes and no shared storage. Odds are if you're running an always-on AG and you're here to hear a talk about it, you're probably not using shared storage. If you're using the combination of an AG and an FCI, FCIs would require that. Node majority is a little bit easier to handle if you have an odd number of voting nodes. That's probably the easier way to do it, but it kind of goes back to the point I had on the last slide, is that that's also where you need to understand how your cluster is going to behave. If you have an odd number and maybe it's across 2 data centers or 2 racks across 1 room or something like that, it's good to think through what all the failure scenarios might be so you know how to react accordingly, and your operations folks know how to do that too, and how to bring the cluster back as quickly as possible. The last 2 on the bottom, I see a lot less fast. Disk only is really not recommended at all. Node and disk majority is here because it's a valid mode. Odds are, like I said, anybody using an AG is probably not using this, so I'm not going to dive into that here, but happy to handle questions about it. So, David, I'd like to grab a drink of water. So are there any questions?
I think right now I don't see any in here, but if you have any questions up to now, definitely get them in here.
All right, cool. Okay, so one thing I would like to see is a lot of times when I give this talk, so I have a couple different always on talks I give. This is more basic, just kind of general tips, things I've learned the hard way that I hope you don't have to. I also have a talk that's SQL Server 2016 and 2017, always on AG improvements. And read-only routing lists are in both talks, and that's because this is a feature I really, really love. And I do understand the argument where, you know, if you're sending a workload to an AG replica, you have to pay to license it. I understand Enterprise Edition is far from free, but I've seen this get around companies spending a lot more money than this cost. So I'll go over what it is, I'll go over what we need to set it up, and then I'm going to give you a case study that I experienced that even as much as I fought against it, it ended up being a pretty great thing. So what is a read-only routing list? It's kind of what it sounds like. So what it does is you connect to a listener with a connection string property, and it's application intent equals read-only. And you'll see that in one of my demos later. All that is basically telling the listener, I need to connect to you to do something, but I'm not going to write anything. So if you have the ability to send me somewhere where all I can do is read, I'm happy to do that. And the listener will handle that. So you have to have set up some of your replicas as readable secondaries. I don't have a slide specific to that, but if anybody has any questions about that, throw them in here. Feel free to email me, tweet me afterwards. This is configured per availability group node, and you'll see it's not a strict part of the demo, but I've left one of the scripts up just to show you kind of a basic script. I have a 2-node AG running on VMs, and I can just kind of show you what that basic setup looks like, and I'd be happy to send that script out to folks who need it as well. What is a read-only routing list not? It is not a load balancing mechanism unless you have SQL Server 2016. If you have 2016 or later, you can, with a very simple adjustment to the script that creates that list, it will actually implement round robin load balancing natively. So it's pretty cool. It does not have any insight into the health of the node at all. So if you have a replica that's really struggling under some horribly written statement, and it's, you know, CPU 99%, memory's all gone and all that, unfortunately the listener has no insight into that. Once its number comes up again in the round robin, it will try to send something else over there. The way to get around that is, of course, there are things you can buy and stuff like that, but there is basic load balancing if you're running an AG on SQL Server 2016 or later and using read-only routing. So what is required to set one of these up? The AG must have a listener, and I will say most of the ones that I see, I do see that. I definitely recommend that. One of the nice things about an AG from a DBA standpoint is that we're able to kind of abstract the user, especially folks that are directly connecting the stuff to run queries or whatever. We're able to kind of add a bit of an abstraction layer between them and us. So, you know, we're able to take servers maybe in and out of the group for maintenance, whatever, and nobody knows. And having a listener can kind of help wean the user from, well, there's one particular replica that I like to go to run my stuff. That gets in the way of us trying to do our job and keep all the nodes healthy, happy, and all that. So if you're not using a listener, definitely recommend that for that reason and the ability to plug in read-only routing as well. And as I mentioned earlier, one or more of the replicas must be readable for this to actually work. So the reason that I'm a big fan of this, I've seen it solve a lot of issues, and the case studies you often hear talked about is you've got a reporting group and either they're using software or maybe they're not as skilled at T-SQL as some of us think we are, and you want to kind of give them their own playground where potentially they're not going to impact read-write performance. Read-only replicas are great for that. There are some edge cases where if the query's bad enough on the replica, it can still back up the primary. I don't have a slide about that, but just keep that in mind. Happy to chat about that as well. So those are kind of the typical case studies. The one that I experienced is we had reached a point with a product that I used to work on where as the lead, you know, I was running all of our monitoring stuff, and I could see where as our application matured, as our data size grew, my brilliant without fail database design, which is far from true, was going to have some issues in the next, you know, probably 6 or 8 months. You could map the data growth rate, you could see performance start to degrade in certain parts and say, gee, really, there's some mistakes I made that now that I'm seeing this run, you know, here's what I'd like to go back and do. So I went to the dev team, and I was still helping them out quite a bit, even though DBA lead was my title. I was still helping them write code and stuff. It was a fairly small shop. And I said, listen, we're going to have a big problem here. in probably 6 or 8 months with a couple modules. And here are the design changes I would like to make. And they listened and said, well, is that going to trigger any work from us? And it was going to trigger some minor changes to certain things. And the way our development and deployment processes were at that time, I really just couldn't go in and change underlying design. It needed approval from the team, which I didn't get. And they basically said, we can't fit that into our backlog for about 9 months. So figure out another way to fix it. And this was around about the time that we had chosen to adopt AG, set up SQL Server 2012, all that. And you know, and even though I think anybody who's designed a model, deep down you always want it to be perfect, and you never want to have to compromise. What I realize is, well, you know, I'm not going to be able to fix this. I don't want to expose us to a potential issue that's database design related that we knew about and just kind of squabble about and didn't fix, and then the customer paid the price. So I recommended using read-only replicas to direct these reads to tables that weren't designed quite right somewhere else where they couldn't damage the read-write performance that on our particular system was very critical. I mean, it was down to the millisecond measured. So if it started to fall off the cliff, we were all in for a lot of late nights and potentially fewer jobs. So that's what we used to fix this. And that's, you know, I think that's kind of outside the usual case studies you hear for this, but as a consultant, I go into a lot of places where there is kind of that constant friction between the DBA team, the dev team. There's designs that the DBAs want to fix that the devs don't because they don't understand, or they don't have time to fit it in or anything like that. This is kind of a tool in our toolkit. If you're fortunate enough to be somewhere, and probably most of you are, if you're here, if you're able to run AGs and you have an application that's facing that kind of impending doom, sometimes putting it in an AG and getting those reads sent to a replica instead of the primary, it's going to give you a lot more time to to fix the issues that everybody wants fixed. It's just a matter of time trying to get to it. So any question about that, I'm happy to chat about that. I'm a really big fan of it, and I'm surprised that I don't see it a lot. So let's get on to our third point here. If PowerPoint, there we go. Okay. So copy user logins, and as all the other parts of this talk come from, this is a mistake that we made very early on. Is we had done, as I think we all end up having to do, there was a job that was created outside of the applications. It was outside of all the normal processes and all the ways we had to deliver notifications and reports and all that to users. There was something very special. It was a financial reporting thing, and we were asked to create a SQL agent job to do only that. There wasn't time to fit it into the app and make it all nice and pretty. Just needed to be a query that sent some data to a group at a state. That was it. And so we went ahead, did that. Primary ran every morning at 6 a.m. Great. They were happy. They got the information they needed. It took a few days versus a few months to go through the product backlog and all that sort of thing. Wonderful. And it was, like I said, a critical bit of data. It was the money that had moved through the system the previous day. If that wasn't signed off on by the start of the next business day, essentially they couldn't do business until that happened. So if they didn't get our email, things ground to a halt quickly. So the first time we failed that system over, because we had done this kind of outside of the normal process, we had created a special login just for this that had very restricted access. But we didn't duplicate that login anywhere else. And so what happened was, when it failed over, neither the job nor the login was there, and nothing was sent. And we very quickly found that out, because at about 6:05, we were hearing from that customer saying, hey, that thing that sends every morning, that's the crux of the whole, business day, we didn't get it. And that was very bad. Thankfully, we were able to address it in time and nothing really happened. But the that was a good way to kind of underscore in my head how important this is. And as a consultant, I see this overlooked a lot. I go a lot of places where the primary is well set up and it's got all these kind of non-standard jobs. Somebody said, hey, we need a job to do this. And the jobs and the logins that correspond to that aren't anywhere. And so just kind of a real brief overview. A lot of us are probably familiar with this, but perhaps not. So this SQL Server's security kind of breaks down into two things. The logins are at the instance level. The users are at the database level. As part of the availability group magic, the users will be a part of once the database is in the group, the users within them are going to be everywhere else. So you don't need to most likely do any additional setup there, and those databases are read-only, so you really can't do anything. The logins, however, will need to be recreated for each instance, so you'll need to recreate those on each node. So what I'm going to do briefly is show you, and this is, it doesn't matter which version, it doesn't matter if you're comfortable with PowerShell or not. This is something that everybody can do. Then after that, I'm going to tell you the way that I would choose to do it now. So we'll switch to this. And speak up if you can't see my screen, please. And so what I've got is, this is the SP Help Rev Login and a helper stored proc. It seems like Microsoft likes to move this around their site. I don't have a link for it in the slides. If you Google or Bing SP_help_REV login, you'll find where it is now. I would recommend saving this as a script, and if you have a DBA or a utilities database, something like that, this is a good thing to have. It can help out with some other issues besides this. So anyway, you just cut and paste it in a window, run it. I went ahead and pre-baked that earlier for us. And so what we've got here is then when you run it, it gives you a list of your logins, and for the SQL logins, it will allow you to create one with a password as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and log into node 1. Let me break this connection here. I know they say never type in a demo, but usually this works. So here we go. And so this is just an account for somebody we've asked to do some basic research. They just need to go into the database, query some tables, look at some stuff. So nothing too big. So they're going to go into testDB. They're going to run their query for world cities because we've asked them for some information on cities. The last time I gave this demo, I was at SQL Saturday, New York City. So obviously the greatest city YN flag has been flipped to 1. So they can do that on the primary, but they're a junior researcher. We don't want them in there running select star from anything anywhere. We don't want them selecting anything from the primary at all. So we tell them like, hey, stay off that. I saw that you logged into it. I'm not comfortable with that. Nothing against you, but go log into our replica and go ahead and do your work there. So they do what I'm doing here. They try to sign in, no dice. So I can't. Well, the reason is because I've made the same mistake that I made years ago. And sure enough, they can't because the login does not exist there. So as the DBA, I go in, I create their login, I get a successful there. So I go back to them. I say, okay, you're all good. Go ahead and sign in, run your stuff. They go to sign in, and the same query should work. Yes, so what you didn't see behind the scenes there, and I want to call your attention to, is if you remember I mentioned the application intent equals read-only, and that's what flags as a read-only workload. In SQL command, it's -K. You fill that in here, and so it's spelled out just like that, and there are ways to do that if you're connecting from .NET or whatever else, but that's the key. So if I had left that out, then they would have gotten another error and says, this database is read-only and you're not permitted to use it unless you use this flag. So that, like I said, that's version independent. If PowerShell makes you nervous as it used to me, this, you can use that. It will always work. That said, it doesn't really scale very well because as you saw, I did everything cut and paste. I'm looking, well, I know I need to move this one, so I've moved that one. So if you have processes that spawn a lot of logins, lots of jobs, things like that, that's not really going to be great. It's going to work, but it's going to take a long time. So here are two other copy user logins, and then I'll get to what I think is the best option, but I do want you guys to be aware of these. I would say these are not officially deprecated because they were community done, but I would recommend taking a look at them, and I want you to know that they're out there, but these are not ones that I would recommend using currently unless they very specifically fit what you can do. If you're not allowed to run PowerShell on your servers or something like that, these might help you out. So SQL Skills had a free tool. It hooks into Management Studio, but only the versions that ran with 2012 and 2014. Nice little tool. It syncs both logins and jobs. Management Studio, the guts of it changed pretty significantly after that. SQL Skills did not change their tool to keep up with that, which is fine. But if you're running 2012 and 2014, as I suspect some of you are, this is kind of a nice little GUI way to do it, which is pretty slick. Unfortunately, after 2014, it does not work. There was also a thing on CodePlex, which is part of the archive now, that was an SSIS package that synced only logins. It was pretty easy to use and it was nice, but it's really limited in what it can do. Here's the best option. So hopefully we've all heard of DBA Tools. It is open source. Really, really awesome people working on it. And it's not, maybe for some of us, you tend to think like, oh, open source, I don't want to run that on prod because I don't maybe trust everybody's contributions and all that. There's a really robust testing framework at play here as well. I have no qualms about running these against prod servers. Obviously, always test on a test environment of yours if there's one there, but this group is doing awesome work. Definitely recommend hitting that site. Follow them on Twitter as well because they'll keep you up to date with what's going on. There are commandlets that they've done: copy-DBA login, copy-DBA agent job. This allows you to run this very quickly. It runs at great scale. This is the way that I do it now. So I want to show you guys the basic way that it kind of works, and everybody's good with it. This is the way I do this now, and this is the way I think you should too. And it's a great way, if PowerShell makes you nervous like it used to me, this is a great way to kind of dip your toe in the water there and just kind of experience it without maybe writing a super complicated script. Any questions about any of that, David, before I dive into the last little bit here?
Actually, yeah, we've got a question up here. Let me scroll here. Is the voting necessary when you are using, actually, let me rephrase that. Is the voting only specific to when AGs are set up with clustering and not for regular AGs?
So that question is more complicated to answer than it was when I first did this talk. So you can have read scale availability groups as of SQL Server 2017, I believe. And David, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. You know that probably better than I. You can have those read scales that don't necessarily require a cluster underneath, but you don't get the availability and stuff like that. It's just a way to scale your reads. The traditional availability group deployment requires a Windows Server failover cluster underneath it. And before the Linux support came to SQL Server, that was a must-have. So if you're doing availability groups without the cluster underneath, then obviously the quorum thing is kind of null and void. To be candid, I have only seen one of those in the wild, and it was a POC. I suspect in a year my answer is going to be different there because this stuff's obviously moving fast, but most of these I see are a Windows Server failover cluster with an AG on top.
Yep, no, I completely agree there. Let's see, other than that, we have one comment: in case it's needed, is shrinking a log file a good idea?
So it's funny because you'll note the slide that's up now. Boy, I would say regular shrinking is not a good idea. I myself, especially in the context of an availability group, do everything I can to avoid having to do that. I understand sometimes when you're taking over the maintenance of stuff, things really went sideways before you got to it. It's a necessary evil, but golly, short of that, it makes me. It's not that it makes me nervous. It works. You shouldn't have to do it.
That's the way I look at it. It's one of those, if you absolutely have to, it's tolerable, but otherwise, try to stay away from it.
Yeah. And where I've seen it is, like I said, you've got a company growing by acquisition maybe, and they inherit some servers that, their care and feeding was not up to par, and then you just got to do it. But if it's something that you've set up and you kind of follow basic best practices and some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here, you should be able to stay out of it. I hope, because it's no fun. It's nerve-wracking. Okay. All right, well then I will dive back into the slides. Hopefully we'll have a couple minutes for questions again right at the end. So transaction log backup strategy. I will say it surprises me how often I go see an AG set up, everything's cool, got all these brand new servers, fast software, fast hardware, all this stuff. And the transaction log backups either don't exist or it's like, well, we do a full once a week. Generally that's not gonna cut it. So as the first sub-bullet there says, it does depend on database workload. Make sure, and this is always, if you're running a full recovery model database, which AGs require, transaction log backup should be a part of what you're doing. If it's not, definitely find something that fits for you. I mean, I know I've run systems where we were backing things up as often as every 3 or 5 minutes to kind of manage that log growth. That may not be the right answer for you. I've also gone places where every 12 hours a log backup was fine. And so it just kind of varies depending on what the nature of your workload is and how hard it's working. But these are important because the transaction log, the size can get out of control really quickly. And that's a really annoying thing to come back from, like we just talked about. As my father-in-law often says, do something, even if it's wrong. He likes to say that when driving in traffic, but that works for us here is, if you're like, well, gee, I don't know how often to back up my transaction logs, you're probably not going to hurt anything by just throwing something at us. So, well, we'll start with every hour. See, maybe that's too many, and the backups are all small. And then if you need to do a point in time restore, that's a pain for you. So maybe you back it off to 3 or 6. But if this is something you're not doing, definitely do it. The recovery time of the database after failover will help if the log is better cared for. Your storage admins will be happy. Generally, that's where you're going to hear about it first. If you're not doing log backups and you're not kind of actively monitoring your server, which you should be, but if you're not, the storage admin's going to come to you and say, hey, that log volume I made for you is almost full. What are you guys doing? And that's, you want to have a positive answer, not, oh, gee, I didn't realize it was full. And so if you follow the tips on this slide, hopefully it won't be full. Like I said, if you do this, you avoid having to shrink that log, which is just, it's a pain. It's something I think you should avoid at all costs. So here's another tip, and this triggered some early morning phone calls in the early years of me running these as well. So we had taken a product that the database was originally on SQL Server 2005. We had a tried and true index maintenance strategy. It worked great, and performance was always good, and we'd run the job for years, and it was awesome. We moved to the AG, ran it, performance still good, things seemed to be awesome. And then the network admins started calling me in the middle of the night saying, hey, we have such and such size pipe from the primary to the backup, and you're filling it up. It's all your servers. What's going on? I said, well, gee, that's weird. We've been running this for years. Well, what we really hadn't thought through is in concert with the growth of the data itself, and we were adding some servers, adding some AGs to support some other customers. What happened is the IP range that the SQL servers were in just blasting data up to the backup data center. And it's because we did what we had always done, which had worked for probably 2 years, is we rebuilt all the indexes at once. So now that I've dove into the story, let me point this out. If you're not doing regular index maintenance, please do. Maybe there's only a few pain points in your system. Maybe it's not that busy, but if you're not kind of analyzing what your performance is, what the key indexes are, when this is going to bite you is going to be a very uncomfortable time. Some sort of performance is probably just going to fall off the cliff, and then you'll realize you should have been doing this. But all that said, provided we are doing it, I'm sure we all are, the strategy here, again, depends on workload. Like I said, it's important. It's important to know your data, know your environment well, know how it's growing, know where the system pain points are, and kind of work around that. An interesting note that I found over the years, and this is a debatable point both in documentation and with people a lot smarter than I am that I've talked to about this, is sometimes reorganized operations for indexes can generate more log traffic than rebuilds. Not all the time, not most of the time, but sometimes. And the reason I throw that in there is not so you take that away and say we should never do a reorganize, because that's not true, but it's understand the impact that your index maintenance is having on your system, and understand what that size and shape kind of looks like overnight. When I was doing this early on, I took the extreme step of I would kind of stay up and watch this stuff, because I really wanted to know down to deep detail what was going on and why. Don't necessarily recommend that because that results in a significant lack of sleep, but understand it. Hopefully you've got monitoring tools that you can use where you're not staying up watching this stuff, but just kind of understand what goes on so you're never caught off guard by this. It's important to remember that anything you do to an index, rebuild, reorganize, especially if the index is large, that's going to generate a bunch of transaction log stuff, and that has to go to wherever the replicas live. And if that pipe is slow, that's a problem, and your network admin will yell at you. So what are some takeaways from this? So do ensure that you're not rebuilding all of them at the same time like I was. It's not a very smart way to go about it. There are some ways to kind of start and stop those. I've gone places where they had them organized alphabetically, things like that. There's some cool stuff in later versions of SQL Server where you can do resumable online index rebuilds, which makes this problem a lot easier to solve instead of kind of crudely breaking things up. You know, the ones that start A to G we do at this time, and H to whatever we do at that time. There's more tools for us now in later versions. Like I said, do closely monitor the lag. Hopefully you have monitoring tools available to you. If not, try to come up with something. Work with your network admins, maybe. Try to home build some stuff. There's a lot of resources out there, a lot of great vendors too. Do not reorganize every index each day at the same time unless you like your network to look like the picture on the right. So this demo is going to be very, very quick. I'm going to show you guys. So this, and I put this in the slide just because sometimes it's easier to distribute this way. There won't be a quiz on what all this says. I realize the type is very tiny. So what I'll do is I'll kind of show you, this is something I found handy, regardless of if you have a monitoring tool at your disposal. What I did is this query came off in MSD Insight years and years ago. I always carried this query with me because I found this was easier to execute against the server. It was quicker than getting into any of the monitoring tools, anything else. So I generally had this on one screen and IDERA, SentryOne, Foglight, whatever on the second screen. And while that was kind of spinning up and I was trying to get my stuff, I was running this. And you don't need all of this, but what this does is this gives you a good picture of your system instantly. And you can kind of call this down to what you need, but it also kind of translates some things from DMVEs into text. So you can look at this and say, oh, I know this node is the primary. Here's the last LSN that did anything. You can kind of see statuses in plain text. And I always liked having this because when I was pulled into one of those hotline calls, I wanted that instant answer. I didn't want to have to say, well, I'm spinning up the monitoring tool that takes 40 seconds, so I don't know. I could always get this running by the time I was on the phone. So I always tuck that into these slides for that reason. The more traditional way to do this, and it uses a lot of the same DMVs and it's improved quite a bit, is the dashboard. You just right click there, you show dashboard, and hopefully we've got all green check marks everywhere and all that sort of thing. So that's the basic demo of that. Like I said, that query, if you're administering these in production, it's handy. I always tried to have a copy of that everywhere that I needed it. And it definitely, on those types of calls, sometimes time is of the essence. Sometimes you've got pretty high level folks on there, depending on the customer that's down. And I always felt like correct, quick answers, while limited in scope, made me look better than I'm waiting for the thing to start. I'm probably not going to get through all these slides, but I wanted to tuck these in. So this talk, it's changed a bit over the years, but the guts of these tips remain the same. One thing that's been added into Management Studio 2017, and like I said, I won't read through these slides, but I want everybody on the call to know that this exists. So new in Management Studio 17.4, which was released last December, is there are latency reports. They're pretty limited, and you can go through these slides, and I'll show you here. There's an excellent link at the bottom of this slide, and it's really detailed. It's a Microsoft blog on everything it does, everything it shows, how it works, and all that. But if you're running 2014 SP2 or later, you can use these. And this is, it takes 2 minutes to collect the data, but this is really going to help your troubleshooting over the query that I just showed you. That's going to be instant answers, but like I said, scope is going to be very limited there. This gives you some reports you'll have after a couple minutes to kind of dive in further. And I found these, and I won't mention names here. These reports in some cases are superior to what some of the monitoring tools do. So I want everybody to know about this. As long as you're running Management Studio 17.4 and you've got 2014 SP2, 2016 SP1, or 2017 RTM, you can use these. I will quickly break this down to show you kind of where it talks about collect latency data, that's here. You click that, it creates an extended event session for 2 minutes, and then when you want to go read the reports, you right click on the AG, go to reports, standard reports, and you've got those two there. Handy, native, and free is always good. So let me get this switched back. And David, with that, that's all I've got. I think we've got 2 minutes left.
Sweet. We've had some really good questions come up. I've answered most of them here, but essentially there's one I want you to cover here. What is the best practice to upgrade in availability group? And in a nutshell, what are your recommendations there?
So the classic consultant answer, right? It depends.
That's the classic DBA answer. The consultants just pick that up, right?
Right. Well, yeah. That's it's just we all say it. Yeah. So that's an interesting one, and for me, it depends on a couple of things. I always preferred to build everything up clean and new, and and this depends on data size and all that, but if you could build a new AG, in parallel with the other one, do some sort of cutover, that that was always my preferred way. Now, SLAs and stuff didn't always allow us to do that, so then you'd have to get creative. If you've got 2016 or later, distributed availability groups can be a pretty interesting way to do that. Because you can have different versions across so you've got kind of an availability group of availability groups, and you can have, you could kind of join your new, let's say secondary, for lack of a better term, to that distributed AG. It gets the data then from the first one, then at some point you can cut over and kind of sever the other one. That is involved. There's a lot of infrastructure going on there. That's not for everybody, but I have done that, and it worked surprisingly well for a feature that's pretty new. But I guess the basic advice, especially with the time we have left, is I would say if you can build things up from bare metal and the database is of a size where you can cut it over inside your SLA, I would recommend that. I've done cluster migrations across domains and trying to upgrade things by version, and even followed the Microsoft white papers on it. It's pretty error prone, and it's really nervy. So the cleanest way to do it is what I would recommend. But happy to chat with somebody if they're in a spot where they can't do that, because I've definitely been in that spot.
Cool. Well, I think that is it, and we are right on time. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to get them in there quick. Otherwise, I want to thank you for some really good tips there. And as somebody that implements AGs for a long time, you're spot on with all of this. And for everybody listening, these are hard lessons learned. Trust me, these are things that if you're running these in production or plan on it, you will hit these things at some point in time. So, download the recording, check out the scripts. These are all things that you really need to master.
Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next month.